Hi all, I am Vijay Jethani. This is exam preparation session for AZ-204. First of all, let us look at exam construct. You will have approximately 45 to 50 questions, and this exam is divided into three sections. First, multiple choice, scenario or solution requirement, and third is a case study. Now this you can get in any order. There is no fixed order as such. You can get first as a case study, followed by scenario or multiple choice. This can be in any order. However, overall you will have three sections. And out of these sections, multiple choice you can move back and forth. Similarly, for case studies also you can move back and forth. However, for scenario and solution requirements where you have to say yes or no for that particular scenario, there you cannot move back and forth. Okay, now this exam will be for 2 hours and you will be measured on skills across these 5 modules, which are compute solutions, Azure storage, Azure security, monitoring, and finally the third-party services like API management, event, and all those things. Now to get started, let's look at what we have in each of these modules. For module 1, which is compute solutions, you have PaaS services, which are container instances, container apps within containerized solution, along with the container deployments on app services. Second is again app services, which is nothing but the web apps. And third is the Azure functions. So this is what the module 1 will have. Similarly, module 2 will have the Cosmos DB along with the Azure Blob Storage. Security module will cover most of your Azure AD, Key Vault, and all security related solutions. Monitoring will have more on caching, similarly around how do you use Azure Monitor, how do you troubleshoot using application insights. So that module will cover those particular services. And finally, on the third party or consuming or connecting to the Azure services, you are having implement API management, event-based solutions, and messaging-based solutions. So ideally what you see here is nothing but these are all the PaaS services used for this particular exam. Okay. Now, as this is a developer exam, you not only have to do the configuration, you also have to know these implementation from a CLI, from a configuration from respective IDs. So these all will be included in the exam. Now difficulty level of this exam is moderate. That means if you know the concept, I think you should be able to clear without any challenges. There will be code as well as complete the CLI kind of thing, along with the concepts being measured from these particular modules. However, baseline is this is a moderate difficult level exam. Difficulty level is moderate. So you should be able to clear it without any challenges. Okay. Now let's start it with our first module, which is on develop Azure compute solutions. Now on this, first of all, try to understand what exactly compute services are there on Azure. Now from this particular diagram, you can clearly make out we have the two options. One is to go for the greenfield, which is build new, which is this, versus migrate. That means already you have something legacy which you want to migrate. Okay, depending upon whether you are doing lift and shift or you are building new, you are presented with options on which services basically you will select on Azure. If I have to build new versus migrate, if I want full control, obviously I will go with the virtual machine. Similarly, if I want to run some batch jobs equivalent to HPC workload, I will select Azure batch. And if I want to do a containerized solution like Spring apps, I can select accordingly that. However, if you see all of these services, right from virtual machine, these are compute services fitting in either infra as a services or PaaS. However, in this particular exam, you will be only measured on PaaS services. That means functions, app services, container instances, and apart from the how you do the durable functions and all those things. But from the concept perspective, I have just put this so that you are aware of what are the actual compute services available on Azure. Okay, so this is just a brief diagram explaining you what compute services are available on Azure. So I will pause here so that you can actually look at what services you see in this particular diagram before we move further. And these diagrams are publicly available. You need not have to take screenshot or copy of that. So based on your demand, whether we want to use compute full control based services, which is nothing but the VM Kubernetes kind of thing, versus the container services or the platform service like app service or Azure functions, depending upon our needs, we will select that. While we move further in this particular exam, you will understand each and every services from a PaaS aspects. Now let's start first of all with the app services. What exactly is the construct of app service? Now app service as a platform, if you see from a language and framework, it supports pretty much everything on ASP, Java, Ruby, Node.js, PHP and Python. Similarly, if you have been working on web jobs, they are basically just for Windows instances. If you want to use Windows and Linux both, then obviously you have to go for Azure Functions. So this is something on language and frameworks which you see in the app service as a platform. And as this is a PaaS services, obviously you're patching, maintaining the OS and everything is done for you. However, you have to still configure the particular app services or deploy the code to that particular app services. And coming now to the containerization in Docker, if you want to have a customized image of the Docker and want to install on the app services, you can do that for Windows as well as Linux. And you can also use the Docker Compose while you deploy this to on an app service as a container. Now, these are first basic things on what you have out of PaaS. Apart from that, you also have the deployment related aspects like DevOps. You have a good integration with Azure DevOps, GitHub, Bitbucket, all those things. And you can also have the staging and the test environments where you can actually test your code before you promote that to the production. Now this is just to give you, being PaaS, it provides you plethora of integration as well as the services which you can leverage for making it functional. Correct? Also from scale, which you see and availability, you say you can scale out manually and automatically. Similarly, you can host your apps and also have a configure or select the app services based on the high availability requirements. And out of box, you also have the connectors which provide you access to SAP and other services which can be integrated with this app services. Okay. And from security and compliance, you are compliant on ISO, SOC and PCI. You can have the IP address restriction. You can have managed service identities and even prevent subdomain takeovers. Now, this is the concept where you ideally create a test record within your domain naming servers so that your subdomains cannot be taken over while you delete them or you recreate them. Okay, so from authentication, you see that you have an authentication, pretty much everything what you see from what we call as P2P services, even B2C services. That means you have business to consumer also connecting to this app services. Similarly, out of box, you see the application templates available to you, and also the good integration with your ID tools, whether this is Visual Studio Code or your own Java tools, which you are using in and out, day in and out. Okay, and out of box also you can have whether you are using the app services for a front end or back end. I think you can have those integrated along with the post support, cross origin resource sharing. Okay, so this was just an overview of what the app service is all about. Now from exam point of view, I think it is important to know first of all from a PaaS aspects what you can do, and you know which particular services you can integrate with. So to start with, I think it's good to start with first of all which specific plans you can have within app services, and in exam obviously you will be there will be questions around using free versus shared versus basic and all those things. So you have to select an appropriate answer for that. Now in simple, I can give you example, like say suppose they will ask you for in which specific plan you can have a virtual network connectivity. So that starts with a basic plan. However, if there is a scale requirement along with that, that you require a minimum of 5 instances. So in that case, you can't use basic. You have to go with a standard because this has a limit of going up to the 10 instances. Also, there these all questions can be clubbed with depending upon the size of this space you have. So overall, what I'm trying to say here is basically you have to go through what app service plans are for Windows as well as Linux, and this app service plan at a broader level help you select first of all the operating system in which region you want to have the instances created and number of VM instances based on the app plan you select. You will get a small, medium and large based on the size of VM instance you're trying to use. And finally, as I already said, while you select the pricing tier, most of the things you will be seeing that like number of VM instances come automatically with that. Okay, and you can really move from free, shared, basic in Windows specific. But if you see the Linux plan, I think you don't have the shared dev test environment in Linux. You go from free to basic as a first. So this is a difference which you see in the app service plan. Rest all, I think there is a lot of similarity. Most of the things remain same, but go with the parameters written at the left and see what are the limits you see for the app service plan. So you will obviously get around 3 to 5 questions around the app service plan itself, and you have to select appropriately. Now moving ahead, selecting the plan and knowing the app service is one part, but how do you configure and deploy them? So let's look at the CLI part of it. Now these are again the public example available publicly. So to show you the example, I think if you see the how do you do the deployment with the help of CLI, the good and the best part is you have to run through or at least walk through this code, CLI code. That way you remember what kind of the subscription IDs and how you do the settings of your account before logging into your own subscription. And then from here onwards, it is setting up your variables and creating the resource group, followed by creating appropriate app service plan, and then creating actual web app and doing the deployment and even integrating that with your repository. So what I'm trying to say here is basically there will be questions in exam where you have to do the drop down selection based upon the parameters listed here. That means you already given some of the parameters and the value is set here. The drop downs will be actually targeting these particular variables, the values set here, and you have to select appropriate value. Similarly, there can also be the command just what exactly you want to select here while you are creating a web app. Similarly, for your app service plan, what are the options? You should know the sequence of steps which you will follow for creation of your app services. Okay, so this was one example from the CLI which you have to remember. Similarly, there will be the option for also on the questions on how you actually do the deployment to different slots or staging and staging environment, and the how do you make the deployments on staging or swap from staging to the production. Now in this particular example, you also have the specific script, or I would say a CLI block. You have the variables set here, what are the GitHub repositories at initial stage, and then you go through each command line of how you actually create a resource group, create the app service plan, and finally going on creating your web app, and followed by that you have to create a deployment slot. Okay, so this is the creation of your deployment slot. And how do you configure your slot is what is the next step. So basically, if you know how you are doing your day-to-day work on your app services and web app, this will be very easy for you. But if you have not done before, I think you can use these examples which I'm showing here to actually configure these particular websites. That way you will get a confidence, because there will be sure shot more than 10 plus questions on exam which will test you on the CLI. So this will be very handy and easy marks, I would say, to score if you already know the sequence and you have already been working on the app services. Okay, so if you have time, I would say while you are preparing for exam, to go through all of them and navigate through the CLIs. Okay, because that will help you or give you confidence of what are the different ways you can configure them, or what are, I would say, what are the different let it be the containers and basic app service settings, what are the configurations, how you do the custom domain mapping and all those things, how do you scale, how you actually protect them. So these all will be very handy while you actually go and actually sit for the exam. Having said that, like also just to give you an info, like you at least need a preparation for 2 to 3 weeks, because this involves a lot of coding examples. This involves a CLI, even though the difficulty level is moderate, but unless and until you know those CLIs or you are working on the code, it can be difficult if you don't know about the CLIs or you are seeing those CLIs for the first time. Okay, so there is a caveat there. For the developer who is already working on Azure, this will be a medium difficult level exam. Okay, so this is on CLI. So let's go back and see what we have on the other part. So now let's see how do we set the staging environment. So again, the other part from app services till now, what we have seen was a basic pass and what are the app service plans and how do we create the app services. But if you look at the staging environments here, basically it gives you what are the plans supported. First of all, that means you can't have the staging in your basic and the free tier. So minimum is required to start from standard. That is the first thing you look at. And how, while you are using the staging environment, what are the prerequisites for that? You can go through this particular stage creation of the staging environment. Similarly, you can have the variation of the traffic. That means how do you route the traffic, 0 versus 100, or even in between, if you want to do kind of a canary, kind of a 5% on the staging versus something on the 95. So that also you can do. But important thing to know here is, while you do the swapping operation, what are the specific settings and connection strings. This is also an example where you can see what specific and connection strings, continuous deployment settings, app service authentication. So these are the swap operation steps which you have to go through. Okay, so ideally for these exams, basically, if you remember, like while swap operation, these are the settings which are swapped. Okay. Similarly, settings which are not swapped. Yes, so there can be a drag and drop or a multiple choice on that based on which are specific settings for swap slots and all those things while you swap the slot from staging to a production. Okay, so these are few things I think I would say this requires obviously navigating from the documentation stuff itself and how you actually configure them. If you are well versed with the app services and you are doing in and out, I think then you won't face any problem. But then if you are not done this before, so I would say spend some time on these particular swap settings and slots. So what are we covered till now is basically going through an app services. What are the plans available for app services? How do you do the deployment using CLI, and then finally looking at these slots. Okay, so let's see what next we have for the app service. Next we have is a custom domain. Now again, custom domain, as I said, there is a prerequisites of how you configure that. And again, as I'm using the public websites, I think this is very well, you will be able to get through them if you go to the app service documentation and going searching for a custom domain. Now in this, basically your root domain is actually your main domain, and followed by subdomain will be www, or even the anything towards left of contest.com will be your subdomain. And while I said, while you configure this, I think there is a step-by-step instructions given right from how you do this. Now in exam, basically you get a arrange the steps how basically you will configure a custom domain. So from exam aspects, I think you should know where exactly or what are the steps you follow. So first you have to add a custom domain, and then followed by that, I think in that particular you have to bind the certificate, and this is exact the screenshot of how you do. Okay, like from while you do this particular while you adding the domain, you add the managed certificate if you are using app services directly, or if you have your own, then you can use add certificate later. And depending upon you are going by IP base or naming base, so you have to select the option accordingly, and the domain which you want to have configured. Now apart from this, I think these are the two important domain validation parameters, CNAME and text, which you have to copy and actually configure on your domain naming servers. Okay, so that this particular validation is only available to you and there is no subdomain takeover because of. So this helps you primarily for your any threats for your subdomain takeover. That is what is written here. If you see, for custom domains you previously configured without verification ID, that means if you don't have this, you should protect them from same risk by adding the verification text record to your DNS configuration so that there is no subdomain takeover. So this basically helps you configure first of all custom domain and then verification of that on the public name server. Okay, and this is how you actually your DNS record will look like once you configure them. This is the, I think this is pretty much what you have here. This will the domain records will look like, and after you add this is more of a validation. Okay, so the text part will help you with the validation of that and custom domain ID, and finally you validate and complete. That is the third step. So basically, if you will get a sequence or arrange this in a sequence for custom domain, if you know these steps, I think you should be able to arrange them without any challenges. So that's done from custom domain. Now apart from this, there are also you do the actual configuration settings for your apps. Okay, so while you do the configuration setting, how that looks like, again they have given a screenshot in the documentation itself. How this looks like is right from configuration of your application settings, which was in your config web.config, or you can directly do on the portal. Similarly, for your connection to the database, also you have a connection strings. So these all basically they look at this particular examples and also give you something of key value pairs to match through. Okay, so that I think you should be able to do in a drag and drop kind of thing. So if there is something on particular app strings or app settings or connection strings. Okay, so this is just the know-how of how the app service is constructed. Okay, so nothing much here apart from how you navigate through end to end and what are the settings you configured on. And more apart from the app settings, if you go to the general settings or if you have configured your app services, you can actually select the stack, platform, and relevant. I think you can go through all of them depending upon the time you have. Okay, but ideally this is the pretty much basic what you have while you configure your app services. Now coming back to the diagnostic logging. Now apart from doing the day-to-day work, we also have to look at what kind of the logs we can get from a app service. Now if you see the logs which you can get from an app service based on the Windows or Linux platform which you have selected as a part of your plan, you will be able to get application logging, web server logging, detail. So this is again a few things which you have to look at what you can get out of box from this app service platform. Okay, similarly, how do you, if you are on a Windows instance, how you enable that? Similarly on the Linux also, how you enable them and what kind of the criticality or the level of the logs you can get. So this is again a know-how of how you work on from a monitoring or getting the logs from the app service. Now finally coming to the auto scaling. Now what is an auto scaling? Now if you see, ideally for any of the platform services or the instances, they should be able to scale up and scale down. Okay, so we have basically three options here. First is manually, obviously in basic basic, I would say shared, and they only have one instance, but from a basic onwards I think you have minimum of 3 instances where you can manually scale, but from standard onwards I think you can use the auto scale. That is what it is written. Similarly, you can also apply rule base and schedule base. So these are the options which you have to go through and remember some of them, especially for automated scaling, because this is only available in Premiere. It is not available up to auto scale. So by default, manual and auto scale will do most of your things, but I think if you want have warm instances the way it is shown here, similarly your the higher configurations, that is only available with the automatic scaling. And see, there is pretty much, I would say there is a lot of reading, but as this is being exam preparation session, I'm just giving you the pointers of how would you able to make most out of it, because you can't go through complete documentation of each and every service. So that is where this links comes handy, so that you can concentrate on only those particular from a what is included in exam or from configuration aspects. Okay, so this completes our app service as a from a compute solutions. Okay, so app service was the first which we have in a developed compute solutions. Now let's move to the Azure functions. So we come here. Okay, so first of all, what is the difference between app services and running a Azure functions? Obviously, app service is something running 24/7, and function is being used for a only period of time. It can be scheduled, it can be kind of a event and action kind of a environment where you want to run a particular code for some time, and then it has to do its own job, and finally once the results are there, I think it will scale down or shut down the instances. Okay, so this kind of the work is basically supported by your Azure functions. Okay, so now if you read out this particular is basically to give you, it extends the Azure App Service Application Platform with capabilities to implement code triggered by events. Okay, also it has a third-party integration along with an on-premise systems. Okay, similarly for code developers, we have to write less code, maintain less infrastructure, and save on cost, as we don't have to maintain servers. This is obviously from a PaaS aspects. And if you really see the scenarios under that, I think here is what, if you want to process file uploads, then run a code while file is uploaded or change in a blob storage. So that is, these are the scenarios given for Azure functions. Okay, similarly process data in real time and working on the data models while pulling out something from a queue. Basically what we're trying to say here is these are not 24/7 available services. We need some kind of input, some processing happening at Azure function, and then getting some output. Okay, so we have to work in a disconnected environment, or not. I would say the environment is not available 24/7. Only when required that will be available for that processing. Okay, so it can vary from simple events happening on particular Azure services which are triggering that function, and based on the sync or output configured, we are actually having the output from Azure function as required. So these are some of the examples you can see from what we can do with the Azure functions as a service. I will pause here so that you can look through each one of them. Okay, so in diagram, I think in a simple sense, what we are trying to say here is we will have some input binding, there will be something going in an output, and how do we configure them, basically how do we trigger this particular code or function is in our hand. So ideally, if you see in any serverless, we should have an event which should trigger this function, and obviously we need to have some source which will provide the data and output where the actual finished result, or I would say it's basically the results are stored, okay, in a database or in a particular respective tables on storage. Okay, so this is basically, it can also be notification as well. That means you are just pushing out an SMS once your job is complete or something of that sort. That will also work. So to complete this, again, first of all, how do we start with Azure functions is, let's get started with the plans. What are the plans available? Now this will be short questions in the exam as well, like you will get at least 2 to 3 of them minimum on Azure functions as well. Selection between a consumption plan versus premium plan, and there is also one more which is dedicated plan. Now initial two plans, which are consumption and premium plan, both are the plans for Azure functions running in the way we have said that it is not for 24/7. It will only run for that particular scheduled time, or maybe during that trigger. However, in dedicated plan, it is nothing but it is actually using the app service plan itself, where we have enough capacity to run Azure functions as well. Or the other which we talked about was, if you are using Windows instance, you can also use the web jobs on app services equivalent to Azure functions. So you have to remember that web job is only for Windows instances, okay, not for Linux. If you have to use anything on Linux equivalent to the web jobs, then you have Azure function is the only option. Okay, so from the plan aspects, first of all, you go through the consumption is nothing but the default. In this consumption plan, important thing to note here is this will not have any warmed instances. That means If the job is done, the instances will scale down to 0. Okay, so consumption is only depending upon the trigger. It will actually warm up and then actually process your job. Whereas in premium, we are making sure we are at least having one instances available or warmed up for processing immediately. Similarly, you also get a integration with the sorry, virtual network. And dedicated plan, obviously, you will get through the app services. Okay, now if you want more control of running your Azure functions, then what are the options you have available? Now, ideally, if you see, the app service environment provides them more isolation from a particular the way instances are configured. So obviously it supports a high scale, and then there is a secure network access for those particular instances. Similarly, if you have seen the container environment for container apps, which is using the baseline of Azure Kubernetes as a service or Azure Kubernetes as a base, then you go through the container apps without actually having the Kubernetes API access. Okay, and if you want the full Kubernetes API access, then obviously you go with the Kubernetes model for that. However, this will be asked very less unless and until I think this not more on exam as of now, but I think moreover you will concentrate on consumption and the premium plan to select from while you actually do for Azure functions. Okay, so just remember there are the isolation options as well, just for your info. Now, while you are working with Azure functions, as this is not available 24/7, obviously there will be some timeout because there is a request response kind of a scenario here. Okay, so based on whether you are using consumption plan, the default timeout or maximum timeout is listed here, like from 5 is the default and maximum you can have 10. Similarly, in the premium plan, you can have 30 as a default, but maximum is unlimited. Similarly, is for dedicated plan. However, as these are getting scaled, the timeout is depending on the Azure load balancer. Okay, so here it's clearly written because of default idle timeout or load balancer, maximum 230 seconds is what you have as a timeout for HTTP triggered functions. Okay, so remember these are some of the pointers or some of the questions you will get in exam specific for that. Okay, now looking at the deployments as well, how do you actually deploy the code to this Azure functions? Okay, so these are the different deployment technologies available to you, and depending upon the plan you have selected, consumption, premium, dedicated, both Windows versus Linux, you can see almost like what are the options available for package, URL, zip, Docker container, web deploy. These are something how you deploy your code. That means a source control example. Source control is basically connecting with that source control for the automated deployment. Similarly, if you are using FTP or doing the zip deploy, that means you have already package. So these kind of questions you will get based upon the deployment methodologies used for Azure functions. Okay, now the way we have seen for app services, let's look at for the Azure functions. Now for Azure functions, also important thing to know again, what are the scale and limits it can support. Now if you are using the consumption plan, the maximum instances for Windows and Linux is written here. Similarly, the problem it has, it is not having any warmed up instances, so that is the problem you will face in consumption plan. But in premium plan, you already have the warm up instances, and there is a range of again for Windows is 100 and Linux is 20 to 100. So these are some limits which you have to remember while you go for exam, because there will be a drop down or a multiple choice questions asking you for these parameters or the numbers. Okay, and dedicated plan, as this is dependent on app services. If you remember, we were having maximum instances for standard till premium 30 only. So remember, this is 10 to 30 is what we have seen for our basic standard related app service configurations. Okay, and if you are having a isolated environment, that is app services isolated environment, you can go maximum 100 with that. Okay, and obviously the Kubernetes varies by cluster, so that I think is purely depending on us how much we want to scale for Kubernetes, because this is purely a kind of a infra environment. Okay, so these are something which you have to remember. Cold start behavior, I think I've already told, required for consumption. Premium, you already have a warm up instances. Similarly, if you are using dedicated plan, you can, in an app services, you can have always on kind of thing, so that you don't face any problem for that. And similarly, you can run have or minimum instances in isolation and Kubernetes as well. One now, there are also service limits. Okay, so for each of them, I think the timeouts you can go through as much as you can remember, but I would say just eyeball them, just for just knowing you can't obviously remember all of them, but I think the minimum basic thing what I say you can remember is at least these instances what you have for the scale and the limits. So this completes the first part. Now let's look at what we see in the event driven scaling for Azure Functions. Now, while you select the scaling, how it works at the back end is, for the services there's a scale controller which actually has the function host, and within that function host we have the function app running. Okay, so basically this scaling of that particular host instances is what we are doing in case of a Azure Functions, and this is purely monitoring the events or the amount of input we are getting from respective services. You can see there are a number of services at left hand side which are causing the scaling of, depending upon what kind of load we have. We are scaling our instances and then scaling down when the load is down or load is coming down. Okay, so these are the few things you have to remember, and as I said, for each of them, for the behaviors and how basically it works, I think you can remember how this particular function app is working and how this is basically scaling in terms of function Azure Functions. Now coming to the events and messaging is again another topic for Azure Functions. Now, as you know, this is a disconnected environment or the async environment kind of thing. We have to make sure, or to at least understand, there is some trigger and how are the bindings. Bindings are nothing but the source and sync part of the Azure Functions, how we are connecting to that. And obviously, if you see the event grids binding, similarly the trigger and out binding, I think you will understand more on how exactly those particular services are connected to Azure Functions. And it will also give you basically what is used for trigger, what is used as an output binding, and similarly the endpoint for the monitoring. Okay, so while we cover, I think the integration thing at last, I think I will explain you this more in detail. As of now, you just understand that there is a trigger, there is the binding which needs to be configured for Azure Functions. Okay, so as of now you can remember that from events and messaging. Okay, as we have the triggers and binding in here, I think I will show you more details about how exactly or which are the specific scenarios which we can go through. So first thing is, what are they, right? as I've been saying, there has to be triggered which will make this function run. So that is what is written here. Similarly, binding is a way of declaring or connecting those source and sink to the Azure function is what is written here. The example scenario can be queue, can be any job or uploading of the document or anything changed. So those all things can be input, and based on how we want to trigger our Azure functions, that can be listed here. Whether we want to have schedule, then we will have timer. If we want to have based upon the number of or when the data is the message is received in queue, we can have the queue as a trigger. Similarly, event grid is the multiple integration of the services or connecting the different Azure services. So that is what also you can take. And if it does not support all of them, obviously the HTTP, if our services are capable of HTTP trigger, we can use that as well. Okay. So these are the basically just giving you how the trigger and bindings. But important thing to note here is basically what are the construct. Okay, so when you look at the code, how this look in a code, that means if you look at this particular the JSON for the functions and service binding, what you see in JSON, like the data type, what it is handling, and this is an HTTP triggered, okay, and it is a request and the direction is in. So these kind of the things you have to mention or configure in your Azure function. Okay, so for trigger, the binding directions will always be in, but for input and output, I think you have been given a complete charter. Like if you see this charter, this is the Azure services, and whether they can be used as a trigger, input and output is where you see the tick mark. Okay, so this is how you connect your Azure functions from triggers and bindings. Okay, also if you want to really see the code example, I would suggest go to the samples. Say suppose if I want to look for the blob storage, how exactly the code will look like. So you can just go and go for that particular example, okay, using triggers and bindings in Azure functions. So you can just go and navigate through what are the specific constructs for that particular creation of the triggers and bindings in Azure functions. Now this is the one way of looking this, or you can go for a respective examples from a trigger. Like suppose if I want to look at the trigger part of it rather than going to the samples. Now this will give me the complete function which is mentioning the trigger, how, and remember everything in Azure functions is a, like it will be a, it basically in the Azure functions everything is a function. So you will have a group of functions doing some kind of the job for you. So we call this as a function app as such. Okay, now you have three things: trigger, input binding and output binding. Okay, so these all things basically you have to look through code and walk through them depending upon the examples you have seen through. Obviously you won't be able to remember all of them, but I think whatever you can navigate through, that will help. Okay, now coming to the web subscribe, publish and subscribe. Now this is also one of the services of an Azure which integrates with an Azure functions. Now difference is from the previously it was completely disconnected. That means based on the trigger, you were actually connecting input and output, or based on trigger you will basically sourcing and syncing, and the actual processing is done by Azure function. But here it is for real time. That means if you see is basically whatever the real time events, it can be for gaming, it can be for any state changes, it can be for anything which you want input source to be from that changes on the input source triggering the Azure functions and finally processing your final results to any of the other services. You can use this web sub as a service along with your Azure functions. Okay, So for this, I think again there will be questions around this example. Simple, I think they will give you code. If you have selected C sharp, then probably you will get something similar to this to fill up. If you have selected for JavaScript, something similar you will get in the form of either drag and drop or down. So basically they will test you whether you really know these things or not, and based on the we have already seen how the bindings are configured in a JSON file, and direction of that specific trigger, and what exactly name, event, and event type. So these are things basically you can get in an exam for the for this developer related to developer exam for the functions. Okay, so these are some of the configurations. But again, I think this is more on the, as I said, unless and until you read through all of them, I think it will be difficult to understand each of them, and hence I'm just giving you the preparation links so that you take your own time for preparing for the exam. Okay, and if you really want to see, as I said previously also, you can just check from respective how the input binding is looking like, how the output binding is looking like. So this will take you the respective code for that particular example. Okay, now one more important thing in Azure function is the custom handling. Now when this is basically required, now ideally when your language is not supported by function host, that means we don't have the box which understands the language or coding. I would say the code or framework is not, language or framework is not supported, like example Go and Rest. Okay, that is the first thing. Second thing is implement a function app in runtime that's not currently featured by default. That means that runtime itself, the version which you want to run, is not supported by the Azure function. In these cases, you have to have a custom handler for Azure functions. Now, how this looks like, if I want to represent that in a diagram, is basically ideally you are not having this part, which is nothing but a web server kind of thing. So you are having the extension in the function host, which were understanding the code and actually executing your code on your behalf in the host. But with this custom handler, I think now for respective language or framework which is not understood, then you have to pass on your request to a web server, which will be kind of a HTTP. Similarly, response will be also HTTP, and some job this will be done by this particular function code. Okay, so to understand this, I think if you see each of this application structure for custom handling, I think you have to configure a host JSON file at root of your app, a local setting JSON file at root of app, similarly function JSON file, and a command script. So basically what we are trying to say here is, apart from our local configuration, now if you look at the way it is used to handle was a function host. Now this is handled using HTTP triggers. Okay, so now you will have your own binary. So if I have to show you in JSON form, this is how this will look like. Your own app which is directly passing the load or input from HTTP payload. Okay, so this can be your own exe, and accordingly you will pass on the arguments to it. Okay, for that particular HTTP payload. And if you look at the all bindings, I think this can be depending upon what services you are connected, and finally going through the HTTP trigger. I will just show you how this will look like from a the Okay, so in this basically, I think again for this custom handler, I think you will get a drop down of what exactly you are selecting for that particular your own exe, and then going through the respective selections there. Okay, because this is not the normal, you have to have the custom handler, and while selecting the custom handler, I think they will give you an options in a drop down for selecting those particular based on the services they have listed in the question. Okay, so remember again, custom handler, this diagram will be very important for you to understand how you are actually passing. Now whatever was done by this function host, as now this is not understanding, or it does not have the capability to go understanding of that language, so everything has to be done with the help of the custom build, which is nothing but your own exe, which is passing on the HTTP payload as input, and then finally processing the response to the function host. Okay, so remember this as a basic. Now coming to the last part of the Azure functions is the durable functions. Now again, this in exam, I think you will get basically from understanding aspect, when are first of all durable functions used. Okay, so you should understand what is the purpose of using durable functions. Now where you see the long running jobs which cannot run, or maybe it requires a the polling. Okay, so in those kind of scenario, I think you need to have a configuration of durable functions where you have an orchestration function, which is nothing but which a how part of it. That means it will plan exactly the sequence in which the job should be running, and there will be an activity functions which will be doing the actual job for you. Okay, similarly, if by default the Azure functions are stateless, so if you wanted to retain state and want to query them for input, or like that means reading them or even storing them somewhere, then you need an entity function to do that job for you. And client functions are nothing but the integration from your client to this particular durable is what you have to do. Now for each of them in this particular again documentation, you have been given what the orchestration function does. Okay, so you are basically executing, actions are executed, and the order in which actions are executed is what the orchestration functions does. Okay, similarly, if you see the activity, they are nothing but a basic unit of work. Any job you do or task you do will be taken care by an activity function. Orchestrator role is to just select how and which way they should be organized and which way they should be called. However, actual work is done by an activity function. Similarly, if you are looking at entity function, this is more of a how that particular state is being saved and how you're reading them from a respective source or sink. Okay, so basically you want to have a state saving mechanism with the help of entity functions. Client functions is, as I said, it's more of a binding or connecting with the client so that respective triggers, let it be an orchestrator or entity related triggers, can be fired from once we have the client connection to this particular services. Okay, so this was, I think, the last part for the Azure functions. So again, from exam perspective, I think short questions on the plans, Azure function plans, and also on the limits, timeout limits. Similarly, there can also be the question on when you will use the durable function or defer the actual work on immediate response when you are actually facing problem with the idle timeout for the load balancer. Okay, for longer processing time, that means if you want to run them and want to have the timeout limits even going beyond 230, then obviously you should go with the durable functions and return an immediate response. So there can be any questions around the basic concepts. As I said, a developer exam not only test you on the coding skills, but I think it's more of how you or what you have understood from the services and how they work. Okay. The again, as I said, while I do the last module, I would go detail into actual triggers and bindings for so that we understand from event and messaging part. So that is the reason I'm not covering this particular module, because in interest of time, I think we have to cover compute basics before we can actually go in the triggers and bindings. But overall, understand the scale limits. How do we scale the functions? What are the different events and messaging systems you can integrate with? And in triggers and bindings, what are the different types of what can be used as a trigger, what can be used as an input binding versus what can be used as an output binding? These are some of the examples. And web publish sub is again the special services which you can integrate. Basically, this is for real time publish subscribe. Okay, remember the difference between the normal web subscribe, what you do from the queue, is different from web subscribe, because this is used for real time publishing subscription services. Okay, and custom handling, again this deals with the languages and frameworks which we don't support out of box for Azure Functions, or runtime is not supported. Durable functions is where again we have seen the examples of here as well, where the timeout, similarly the long processing jobs require durable functions. And what makes up the durable function is what we have covered, that is the orchestration function. Then you have seen the entity function, activity, and obviously the client functions. So these are the 4 functions within the durable, is what we have seen in the Azure functions. Now coming to the last part, which is the container services of the module, of the first module. Now first of all, let us see what container options we have. If you are working on the container environment, what options you have and how you choose them. So if you see the all of them, like app services, you have seen that you can deploy the Docker images or even the containers, and because that is the base layer which we have gone through as of now. Container apps and container instances we will see in this particular section. And Kubernetes services is full-fledged, I would say, an orchestration layer which helps us deploy and even manage the containers at the scale. Azure Functions we have seen can also be deployed as a container, and Spring Apps and Red Hat OpenShift are again the different options for deploying the containers. But what exactly is given under if you go to the again public URL for compare container options, you will get this particular link where you can go through container apps. So container apps base layer is obviously your Kubernetes, and it has all whatever you have seen from a scaling aspects, similarly from a service discovery aspects. Only thing you don't have in the container apps is you don't have the Kubernetes APIs. That means you are not actually taking control of the actual machines. You don't have actual host. You only have access to your container apps, okay, as a baseline layer. So you can call them as a serverless microservices. That is what you can understand. And app services you have seen is a platform as a services. Difference between this and this is app service have a lot of integration options. Whatever you have seen, it is not just for containers, it is also used for actual our web hosting, backend hosting, even mobile backends. Okay, so remember that containers, a container app is more specific on Kubernetes environment, and it takes care of everything. Let it be your custom images or whatever binaries you bring in shape and form. Okay. Now, apart from this, container instances is something a kind of a machine where you run a bare metal containers. Okay, when I say a bare metal containers is basically you get one particular pod. Now, what exactly the pod is here is you actually take care of the based on the resources you configure the container groups, and that container groups will actually have the that container groups will basically have the what we say in the one particular container running as your services, and another container you can run as the sidecar for monitoring of that particular service. Okay, so now also you can have the integration of this particular container instances with actually with your Kubernetes environment for running a specific jobs. Okay, so difference is this is a bare metal and another one is more of a platform as a services which gives you out of box capability of Kubernetes minus the Kubernetes API or any machine control or even working with any of the uh, the I would say the orchestration or kubectl commands kind of thing. Okay, so you don't have any control over the client machines in the way you have in your Kubernetes environment. Kubernetes services, I think we are pretty much clear. This is a full-fledged version of how you have your own nodes and you can scale based on your expertise. You can consider this again as a mid between infra as a service and a platform as a service. Azure functions we have already seen. Spring app is again one different environment altogether, sitting on the Spring as a Spring stack, which is more on a Java. Okay, so this is a more of a Java platform end to end for the containers. Again, Red Hat is another variation of what you have in a Kubernetes, which is powered using OpenShift. So as of now, I think you can understand just the services. That's more than enough for you to get through the what container options you have. Now moving further, if you look at the what exactly the container apps does, this is more towards how you go through each of the services. Okay, again if you look at this, again the questions will be around when to use container app versus container instances. If you know the specific service, I think you can basically I would say the Kubernetes layer and what kind of things you can do here. You just go through this particular use cases of the container, that is more than sufficient. Okay. This is nothing but the diagrammatic representation of what they have written above. Similarly, if you see what kind of feature sets you have and how do you deploy them. Also here also you will get an Azure CLI, how you actually deploy this container instances, container apps. You have to remember, and how do you pull those images and all those things. This also will be a part of this particular exam for containers. Okay, now coming to the revisions and versioning in container apps. Now why that is required. Now revision is something while you want to upgrade from a one particular version to another particular version, how do you look into? See, these are the one container app 1, container app 2. You see the revision 1 and revision 2. So these are basically the containers running under one particular replica. Similarly, there's equal number of containers running under replica 2, but under revision 2. So there are code changes which needs to be replicated without any downtime. This is how the revision is meant for. That means upgrading or doing some kind of work to bring them up on a revision 2, kind of a versioning of that. However, while you do that, I think you can also split the traffic. So that is what you have written here. releasing a new version of app, quickly revert an earlier version of app, doing some kind of A/B testing before you actually promote the production is what the revision is used for. There is also the traffic splitting, which I have told you, but important thing to note here is basically apart from this, you can also have the labels to it. Okay, so I would show you the labels. So these are the basically nothing but giving, irrespective of how you actually version them, or you can actually label them. That means I can actually have a label for this particular version number 3. Then I just remember this, so that if you see from the this particular label, what it has is apart, irrespective of which particular revision I have to, in case of a multiple revisions running together, I can directly target, if I know the label, I can directly target that revision number directly, rather than always going on the which is the latest revision. Okay, so this is what I can do apart from traffic splitting in the so I think they have already given what kind of the basically what you can do with this. Labels keep the same URL when you move from one revision to another version. Similarly, it can be applied to only one revision at a time. Allocation of traffic space isn't required, because you are now that if you are giving a label, I think you are sure how this will be accessed versus as I said, like accessing the revision 2 versus revision 3. You can access directly using label, so that at any point of time you can access the latest version. Okay, so this is what the use case for your revision labels. Okay, now apart from this, I think the way we have seen in the app services, you also have the custom domain setting in the container apps. Again, there is a step-by-step instructions how you first of all, and remember there will be also a question and exam that how do you, what are the steps. First of all, you enable the ingress and all those things. So this will be very helpful for you. HTTP ingress is enabled, and then what you select for that, how you select the target ports, finally you select the custom domain. So these steps, I think maybe you have to arrange in a sequence, or maybe a drop down kind of thing. I think you have to have taken care in exam. Okay, so just remember and go through these steps for adding the custom domain. That is I think should be sufficient for you to for this particular container example. Okay, now coming to the monitoring, I think again the way we have seen the monitoring diagnostic logs and everything, here also similar kind of log streaming on what are the different ways you can look at the logs, whether you can go to the container console, monitoring metrics, application logging. So these are the some of the things given from monitoring and the logging aspects which you have, which you can go through. Again, whatever URLs I'm using, they are all public URLs. Maybe maybe the end of all modules, I can give you the reference to all of these links, so that you have this handy while you prepare for the exam. Okay, so now this covers your container apps. Okay, so now moving to the container instances in depth. Looks like there was a network glitch, but I think we are back. So for container instances, again, why we need them? Because it is first of all a bare metal. It has a faster startup time. So consider this as a one particular pod, or you have a one particular machine configured which has a very restricted. I think a single machine. I would say you even if you scale, I think you have to scale independently, and there will be no connection between one instances versus another instance which you are bringing on the. So this is the best, I would say, for Azure container instances, they are isolated. That means if you bring up the 4 machines, all 4 will be different. And remember, there is only one instances depending upon the configs or specifics you have provided in the container groups. Only that will be available as a part of that container instances. And you can have a Linux or Windows. Also, you can pull obviously from a private registry, Docker Hub, and everything for running the containers. And obviously you will get a DNS domain name for your container with example. So you will have a custom label based on the name of the and the region, and container.io will be common. So ideally this will be common for all container Azure container.io. Azure region will be basically where you configure this container instances, followed by what the name you are given to that particular container instance. Now there are also security level things apart from this, but I think I would suggest just walk through if you have a time based on the, I think there is something called confidential container deployment, which you can go through. Similarly, if you want to save some cost on a dev part, I think you can also have the spot container deployment. You just have to check mark while you configure those particular services. Okay, now that was one part. Now how do the container group look like? So container group will look like something similar to this. You obviously have a domain name. As we said, this is the container instance name, and this is a region. Container.io is what, and this will have the port exposed, and obviously you will have a public IP. Remember, this is just one instance and a sidecar sitting here versus the actual application running here. Okay, so this gives you whatever you have learned so far container instance. Again, for each of them there is a command lines for the container instances as well, so you can go through portal as well as command line instances. Now this was about how you have the multiple containers running within the container group. But what about if you want to share the data between the containers? Now mounting a empty directory volume is also like how you actually want to map, or I would say share the data between the containers in a group so that they can read write the same files. It is kind of you have a formatted disk available in our virtual machine. Okay, so this is how the particular concept look like from the sharing the data between the two containers within the container instance. Okay, so how do you can deploy that? While you do the actual deployment, I think you can mount the empty directory in a container instances either using a resource manager template or a YAML file. Okay, so they have given you the example of how you do that. Also, if you want to be more specific on the container instances configuration while you do that by mounting, I think you can go with the YAML files. Okay. Now, how do we manage the running containers is more on towards how, again, the way we have seen the monitoring for container apps, similarly is the monitoring or the probes, health probes for your container instances. You can see this create a liveness probe.yaml file with the help of your YAML file, and then you provision that within a container group as a side container. Again, some of the command lines which you can look at. So as I said, I won't spend much time on because as an exam preparation session, I'm just giving you the publicly available links or publicly available, so you can go through that and accordingly prepare yourself. Obviously, unless and until you know that particular service, you won't be able to walk through them unless and until you actually do the practical on that particular theory. Now coming to the last part of this compute model, I think it is a container registry. So what are the, again, the way we have seen the plans, there is also the plan for container registry. So basic is basic, standard and premium you have. Now the difference I can show you again in the service tier and features is, right, just see the basic, standard and premium and just make out its limits. Now example I can give you is like, suppose if you ask an exam like whether the geo replication, in which particular tier the geo replication will be supported, so obviously you have to select the premium tier for that, because for basic and standard this is not available. Similarly is for availability zones, they are only supported for premium. Okay, so pretty much I think you have to go in each and every section through the limits, your its respective plans, and then some walk down of the CLIs is what you have to go through for each and every particular links which I am showing you. Okay, now while we have seen building the images using Docker, currently the exam will also test you on the Azure Container Registry task, which will work exactly same to whatever we have been doing in the Docker. That means right from building the Docker image, pushing that to all tasks you can do in the container registry. So what are the prerequisites and how do you get started on the CLI is what everything is listed here, and how do you actually build and push image. So Docker file creation will be exactly the same. The name will also be exactly the same. If you see the instructions, how you are pulling the images out of the repositories. Okay, so that I think remains same, but instead of Docker build, you are using the now container registry build command with the Docker file, and you are providing the registry part to that. So while this goes through, it also does an internal check of pulling the dependency. That means if this particular Docker file has any dependency, it will list down those dependency so that you can upgrade that. And the advantages I think they have already written here. I can show you. I think there will be somewhere how they are promoting to that particular. So here it is written, ACR task is a feature with container registry to help you manage and modify container across the container lifecycle. So that means patching and everything can be taken care with the help of inner loop, what they call for the image build process. Okay, so again, as I said, 50% of your exam will focus, 50 to 60% of exam will focus more on the CLIs and how the commands will look like, the YAML part of it, the drop downs, so I think you have to be very sure on how you select that, and you should know the functionality in and out before you can actually execute them. Okay, similarly, now going to the multi-container workflows. Now this is more towards the way we have automated or try to run the Docker files. What if I have a multiple step definition? That means while I'm doing the build, how do I configure that one particular file which will do the build, pushing that, and then finally running some commands. Okay, so this is where the multi-step task definition come into the picture, where they have given the instructions of how you build that, how you push that. But now this is more in the form of a YAML than actually running them in a command. That means now with the help of this particular YAML file, I can actually automate my complete deployment for build, test and everything. That is what they have written. Now with the help of this, you can actually do the build, test and patch in the ACR task itself. Okay, so this is really helpful what we are getting out of box for Azure Container Registry. Coming back to the last part, which is an automated container build. Now this is again I have listed here a tutorial. The reason for that was whatever we have seen so far in a container registry task. With this, I think you should be able to see how actually you are actually cloning that particular first of all repository, and then preparing each of those registry right from scratch. Okay, you create a group, then you create a ACR, and then how you build that particular image is what is listed here, so that you get whole experience of how actually that is done in practical. And finally, you're deploying either to container instances or even the, I would say basically for container apps also, and the procedure will not be that much different. Only thing you have to remember the command lines, how you push from or how you pull from the container registry for container to be deployed in any particular service. Okay, so I think this is pretty much, I think we have from this particular module. Now in next specific session, I would cover more developing solutions on storage because this was just module 1. So this particular session is restricted just to the compute service on Azure. So stay tuned for another session which will be on developing solutions on storage, which will be shortly available as well. Okay, so thanks for listening to this particular exam preparation session, and if any queries, I think you can reach out on my channel at DevOps Labs,